So now moving on to breach. This is an absolutely awesome attack that allows an attacker to reliably gather sensitive information from an HTTPS channel. That's pretty darn fast in comparison to previous TLS-related attacks as well. Angelo Prado, Neil Harris, and Yoel Gluck demonstrated this at Black Hat Las Vegas in 2013, and they also hinted at an additional variation of it that we can probably expect to see at a future Black Hat if it makes it past the CFP.
So just a quick history on some of these crypto attacks from past years, specifically crime, is very much related to breach. Crime was actually an attack on the TLS compression of an HTTPS request. So at the time of the attack, Ivan Ristic at SSL Labs had some research published that 42% of sites were supporting TLS request compression. So 42% of sites would have been vulnerable to this full decloaking of the encrypted text of compressed HTTP requests. So just a quick overview of what's different in breach. Breach is an attack on the HTTP compressed responses instead of the request. Okay, so things like DEFLATE using the LZ77 compression or things like gzip would be vulnerable in this regard, right? So just a quick overview of how these compressions actually work. So you can see my example on the slide, Googling the Googles. So the first time a set of characters in a single string is seen in the response, it's left alone. But any subsequent time that exact string of characters is seen, it's replaced by a pointer to the original occurrence of that string. So in this example, you see Googling the G, and then there's a pointer using a coordinate system, which is saying go back 13 characters and then go forward 4 characters. And that is the same string of OOGL, lowercase OOGL. And that's replaced here, right? So to actually see this in an HTML response, so say what we were trying to guess, the string we were trying to guess was supersecret. And we were brute forcing it, and we got as far as supersecret, and then we had an X, was the character that we were guessing, right? When you perform the compression upon that, what you're going to get is a pointer, as you see on the left-hand side here, the bottom left. You're going to get the pointer -22, 10, or something like that. It's going to point to the supersecret, and then the X is going to fall outside of that pointer. So the difference that we're worried about here is the size, right? So the original HTTP response is 48 bytes. And then once compressed, it's 38 bytes, because you're compressing 10 of those characters. So now if you look on the right-hand side and say we were brute forcing past the X and we finally got to T, and we got the full string correct, the difference is going to be 1 byte greater because that X is no longer on the outside, and we compress cleanly the entire secret, which falls to -2211. And then the HTTP response size difference is going to be what we're monitoring here. So a real-world scenario of this would be something like injecting some reflective parameter that we have control over the source code of, and we can start brute forcing something else that we know is also in the source code of the response. So say we have some canary parameter, and we're brute forcing a known CSRF token. We know that a CSRF token exists, and we're going to try to brute force it. As we guess characters, that compression is going to get smaller and smaller because it's going to be successfully compressing the guessed characters as we get further and further into the CSRF token. So live on stage at Black Hat, I think they did this in roughly 1,100 requests, and it took about 30 seconds. I think the talk was called SSL Gone in 60 seconds, and they did it in 30. So this is a very realistic, as opposed to the other crypto attacks that we've talked about. This is extremely realistic. It does not take that many requests on the HTTP compressed responses.
So now let's talk about all the things that we need for breach to work. First of all, we need compression. And lots of web applications use it, obviously, and it'll work against any browser. Also, the pages need to be somewhat stable and not have wildly different responses after subsequent requests to the same resource are made. If they're stable and simple, breach can compromise it quite quickly. They still need to measure the victim's traffic, so man in the middle is necessary. Additionally, we need a secret in the response body, and this can be a CSRF token, a view state, or anything that the attacker would want to get. We also need some attacker-supplied guess that can be reflected in the response body. Now, there is a 3-character bootstrapping sequence necessary, like in crime. And lastly, this works for any version of TLS and SSL with any options that may be in place for it. Now, as for the components, there's 4 critical pieces required for breach. We need a victim and an attacker, obviously. If they're on the same network, that's ideal. They need a command and control center that will perform all the needed calculations, and it's shown here on the same LAN just because we need a man in the middle of the SSL traffic. And then we just need an end-to-end SSL connection that goes out through the internet to our target server. Now, from a high-level standpoint, the command and control center has a web server running on port 81 that's an iframe streamer which injects payloads that trigger HTTP requests on the victim. There's another server on port 82 that's a callback that's registered when responses come back to the victim. And there's a man-in-the-middle component, an Oracle logic portion, and Oracle is the name of their exploitation tool, by the way, and a traffic monitor that will measure compression. Now, what the tool does is measure the size delta between different responses. It'll guess one character at a time, byte by byte. Now, as we mentioned before, compression is built of two components. The first is LZ77, and it compresses repeated strings against each other. So if you have a repeated secret that you're trying to guess, and you guess it or a portion of it correctly, it will compress well, and the tool will be able to detect that the current character or phrase that you're guessing is, in fact, the right one. There are a few roadblocks that can confuse the tool and create false positives, but they were able to account for these situations with a few clever algorithms and backtracking in case they started to guess down the wrong path. So here's what they live demoed at Black Hat, where they successfully extracted the CSRF token of the Outlook web app, and like Matt said earlier, it took about 43 seconds. It's verified here, also showing it in the view source of Outlook. This live demo that they did is absolutely phenomenal. It's quick, it's well presented, and I highly suggest for everyone to take a look at it. Here's another view where you can see several requests being fired off in Chrome as the CSRF token is being guessed character by character along with the callback that's being sent. So it took 1,120 requests in order to recover the 32-character token in about 43 seconds. Now, once that's recovered, it's just a matter of creating a forge request for some CSRFable action and then tricking the victim into invoking it. For their example, they just changed the native language of OA to Russian. And then Matt's going to hit you with mitigation.
So yeah, some obvious mitigation techniques here, and then we actually just published a blog post about raising our bar on CSRF protections. If we use dynamic CSRF tokens per request instead of per session, you really limit the exposure of your tokens, but other PII not so much, so you need to protect against the attack as a whole. So if you randomize the length of your HTTP responses with some padding, some variable padding that is all different length, you're going to make the math pretty hard to fight against in this timing technique. If you can mask your secrets differently with some random XORs or other stuff, it's kind of a dirty hack, but it works. If you chunk the secrets, that's another, using HTTP chunking, that's another technique. But probably the most practical for everyone is going to be throttling and monitoring. Even though this isn't a billion requests like we talked about in the RC4 weaknesses, and it's only 1,100, it becomes pretty obvious if someone's sending 1,100 requests in a short period of time to perform this attack. So if you start to slow those down or monitor when those things happen without affecting usability of your users, you're still going to be able to fight against this attack. And then, of course, if you disable gzip compressions or other stuff for dynamic pages, that would help. But I know that's not a realistic solution for most people using these things, as the performance is going to be way, way higher of a trade-off than it is the security for a lot of people. So, yeah, that's it.